Thank you very much. Well, thanks everybody. It is a privilege to be here today and to talk to you. I love it when I'm in a group of people who understand that this is so incredibly important, who understand that this isn't even just something that we should do, but this is something that needs to come back to who we are. This is central to who God is, and if we say that we're the church, it needs to be central to who we are. So thank you very much for being here. As she said, my name is Pete. I'm with an organization called Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. We were started back in 2004 by a guy by the name of Boz Chividjian, and Boz was a child abuse prosecutor. And one of the things that Boz realized as he was prosecuting child abuse cases is that whenever that child abuse case intersected with a church, people from that church showed up in force, always on the side of the perpetrator, and never on the side of the child. And Boz recognized this does not reflect the heart of God. And so Boz reached out to a number of his friends and colleagues, and he said, we need to do something about this. And so they started Grace back in 2004 with a mission to equip the church to better recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse. The focus was initially child abuse. Through the years, that's really expanded to all forms of abuse across the lifespan. Child sexual abuse, child physical abuse, spiritual abuse, sexual harassment, clergy sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, and many other ways that people experience abuse, and that the church has the opportunity to do such an incredible thing, but unfortunately many times have not. As the previous speakers have shared a lot of personal experience. For me, one of the things that draws me here is growing up in elementary school in a church and Christian school with rampant abuse of every type. Did not impact me nearly as directly as it impacted many people, but the abuse was extensive throughout the church, throughout the school, up to the point of a couple of deaths. So this is one of my early experiences of what is church and what is God. And that's not church, and that's not God. And so we are called to help show that. As many of you are really here today because this is a passion of yours, this is something that you feel called to do, I want to mention just next week, so starting on Monday, there will actually be a 2-day webinar called Keeping Faith. It's going to be online. You can register. That has the page for registration. I'll be one of the speakers. Victor Veith will be one of the speakers. Victor is probably one of the foremost experts on the intersection of child abuse and faith in the nation. And then also Allison Fay, who is the director of the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center. So the three of us will be presenting for 2 days, and we'll be looking at things such as policies, how do we respond to known offenders, are there differences between how boys respond versus girls when they're abused, disclosure dynamics, effective policies. How do we collaborate? How do we work together between the church and mental health providers? How can we understand some of the mental health treatment approaches that a person who's experienced abuse may end up going through? So please, if you are at all able to join on Monday and Tuesday of next week, please sign up. And just so you're aware, if you do, you can enter the code 30 off, and because you came through hearing about it through Grace, we'll give you a 30% discount for registration. As we talk today, we're having this conversation in light of child abuse, but it really does apply across the board to all forms of abuse and trauma that you may encounter. as a church and as believers, as you are trying to prevent when possible. But if that prevention was not possible, how do we respond? How do we care? How do we move forward? So today what we're going to try and talk about is a stronger understanding of what is trauma and what is trauma-informed practice. And we'll look at how do those connect to our faith. Because it is so incredibly important for us to realize this is not grounded in something we should do. This is grounded in who we are. In Jeremiah writes about some of the wicked kings of Israel. And what does he write? He writes, they did not defend the cause of the poor and oppressed. And what does he then say? In so doing, they chose to not know God. It wasn't that they had bad behavior, it was that they chose not to know God. Refusing to care for those who had been harmed in such a way was refusing to know God. And then Jeremiah writes about Josiah, one of the relatively good kings in Israel. And he writes, Josiah defended the cause of the poor and the needy. Is this not what it means to know me, declares the Lord? It's not about what we do, though that is very important, but it must come down to who we are, because it's really a huge indication of whether we know God, because it is so central to the character of God. And then we'll just look at some practical ways that we can try and engage both in prevention and care, both prevention and response. The warning was referenced prior to starting, and I'll just reiterate it again. We're going to talk about some heavy stuff. Please care for yourself as we talk about this heavy stuff. That might be deep breathing, that might be prayer, that might be going over the lyrics and the music of a comforting song. If you find that that's enough, great. If you find that that weight is still too heavy, please know that it's okay to step outside, to take a break, walk around for a little bit, but do what you need to do to care for yourself. That's really important because we are here to follow what God is leading us to do. And there's incredible hope when we follow. But in order to follow, we need to have cared for ourselves as well. You cannot give from an empty cup. So as I said, Josiah defended the cause of the poor and needy, and so all went well. Is this not what it means to know me, declares the Lord? It's not just about something we do. It's about who we are. It's about knowing God. And Scripture is not blind to these issues. Scripture is very aware of what's going on. Whether it's the words of Jesus in Matthew, they come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. That's been mentioned in each of the presentations so far. Because what's going on, this idea of grooming that has been mentioned, preparing that target, it's not just going on with the target. The entire community is being groomed. The entire church is being groomed, and as the entire church is being groomed, the entire neighborhood is being groomed, the entire family is being groomed, they appear like a sheep, but they're actually a wolf, ready to devour. Trauma is throughout Scripture. Eli, one of the priests of ancient Israel, his sons did not follow after God. And instead, God says that they are worthless men. Why are they worthless men? Because they use their position of spiritual authority to have sex with people. clergy sexual abuse being called out in Scripture, Jesus calling out to the leaders of the faith in that day. You make all these long prayers, but all you are doing is you are cheating widows out of their money. Spiritual abuse, elder abuse, financial exploitation. Jesus says, if you harm a kid, it is better for you that a huge stone be hung around your neck and that you are drowned in the depths of the sea. This he speaks into a culture that really didn't care much about kids. And Jesus said, not with me. If you hurt a kid, it's not going to go well. And so this is central, and we see it throughout Scripture. We see the impact that abuse has on the relationship with God. If you've done any research on attachment theory and the idea of this attachment relationship that can develop between a child and a parent, if you look at the things that attachment theory says that a child needs from their parent, those are all qualities of God for the secure attachment relationship. If you look at the ways that attachment theory says you build a healthy and strong attachment, secure attachment relationship that allows you to then have healthy relationships going forward, that allows you to go out and explore the world and have a safe place to land when you need that, they're all characteristics of God. God is set up in Scripture as a primary attachment figure. Scripture is a collection of trauma narratives. And we dig into Scripture and we see a deep, deep theology of the child. I mentioned Victor earlier, and Victor wrote a book called On This Rock, a call to center the Christian response to child abuse on the life and words of Jesus. There's a deep theology of the child. And there is a deep theology of power. As has been mentioned, power is central to abuse. Power is the spoke, or the center around which all the spokes of abuse flow. And there's a deep theology of power. Here's a theology of power, and I can sum it up. If any of you know Diane Langberg wrote this incredible book called Redeeming Power. Understanding Authority and Abuse in the Church. I cannot recommend this book enough. And in this book, she lays out a theology of power in which she says we know about power. Here's what we know about power. Jesus said it. All power is given to me. All power. Nothing's left out. It's all God's. So any power that you and I might seem to have, we are holding as stewards. If any of you have seen The Lord of the Rings, I've heard a few people saw that movie. We've got the steward of Gondor, who is not a very good steward, right? And what's the steward's role? To exercise power the same way that the king would. As a church, how are we doing? With any power that you and I have, how are we doing? Are we exercising our power in the way that the king would? Because we've seen how the king exercises power by calling out abuse, by protecting kids, by protecting those who've been harmed and caring for them. Are we using our power in that way? And what we also see in Scripture very clearly is that the church is birthed through trauma. Throughout the Old Testament, trauma story after trauma story. And then we get to the New Testament, and what happens? Jesus is cruelly crucified on a cross. And then the disciples go out, and there's persecution, imprisonment, more trauma. The church is birthed through trauma. And trauma continues today. And here are just some of the statistics that are up there. This is the population in general. what some studies indicate is that for churches, these numbers are low. That churches actually have higher rates of abuse than the population in general. Two reasons this might be. One reason might be churches don't do a good job with prevention, and churches don't do a good job with response. One reason might be people have been hurt, and they're looking for safety. They're looking for psychological and spiritual context, and as they search, they come to a church. Whatever the reason might be, or a combination of them, these numbers are probably low for where you go to church. But if we look at this, my goodness, how many people do you have at church on a Sunday? Now do the numbers. How many people in your row were sexually assaulted by the time they were 18? How many people in your congregation in that service were hit to the point of injury as a kid? So many people, probably many people here today, and 10% of clergy acknowledge crossing sexual boundaries with people under their care. Trauma continues today, and it has a huge effect. This is an email that I got from a survivor of child abuse who then went to church and was told that the problem was her. As a survivor that sits in the pews at church, it's hard to be there, knowing that many of us have been looked at as the problem rather than the victim. It changed how many view God, and many turned away from the faith because it's hard to believe in someone who allowed this to happen, or in some cases we're told God wanted the priest or the pastor to do this to them. We need to do right as a church, not just to do, but to be. It has to come down to who are we? So, what even is trauma? And this understanding of trauma is something that gives me incredible hope, which is something that I feel I really need right now. When we think of trauma, very often we think of the event, the thing that happened, whether it would be abuse or assault or whatever it might be. We think of the thing that happened, that's the trauma. SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, helps us to gain a better, more holistic understanding of what is trauma. And they give us the 3 E's of trauma. So when you think of a child who may have been abused, when you think of an adult who may have been abused in childhood or as an adult, or somebody who's facing other kinds of trauma, this is the essence of trauma. It includes the event, what happened, the experience of the event. How did the person experience this event? And it includes the ongoing effects of the event. So I'm going to tell you a story in my life that illustrates this. In 2011, I was 40 years old, almost 41. Now everybody knows how old I am. I know I look older. Anyway, it was the middle of the night, and I had this intense pain in my right side, and I woke my wife up, and I said, I think I might be having an appendix attack. Can you bring me to the ER? And my wife is a nurse, also working very trauma-saturated environments, and my wife says to me, you're probably too old for an appendix attack. Thanks, dear. can you bring me in anyway? Sure, I'll bring you in anyway. And I get to the ER, and I finally get in to see the doctor, and the doctor looks at me and says, "You're probably too old for an appendix attack." What? Did she call him? I don't know. But anyway, he said, "Well, your symptoms don't line up with an appendix attack, but on the scan, your appendix is bursting. So we'll go in and we'll take out your appendix. Everything should be fine." They took out my appendix and everything was not fine because the doctor told me, "We now know why your symptoms don't line up. Your appendix was not bursting because of an infection. Your appendix was bursting because of a cancerous tumor that was inside of your appendix and had grown too large for your appendix to hold anymore, and it was bursting out." The next 2.5 to 3 years were absolutely horrific. If you want to read up on torture, you can do a search for a procedure called HIPEC, heated intraperitoneal chemotherapy. It's also known as MOAS, M-O-A-S, which stands for Mother of All Surgeries. They need a better name. So this is what I ended up having to go through. So I had 5 surgeries, including this one, significant complications, ended up hospitalized. At one point was told that I had a 5% chance to survive. So this was my event, right? This is my event. What happened then? We told my pastor. And the next day, the leadership at the church was over at our house praying over us. He said, "At church on Sunday, can we take the first 10 or 15 minutes of the sermon to pray over you and your family?" We said, "Yes." After that 10 or 15 minutes, the pastor said, "You know what? We're just going to ditch the sermon today. We're going to take the entire service to pray over you and your family." After the service, one of our friends came up to us and said, "I know this is going to sound weird, but can I do your laundry?" And for the next year, every Saturday we put our dirty clothes out on the porch, and every Sunday they were returned, folded, and I am assuming clean. It was amazing. We were surrounded. Yes, we had our family around us. Our neighborhood was around us. But more than anything, our church. And you know what? Never once did anyone at church say to me, "Pete, you're 310 pounds. What did you expect? Pete, you have a diet high in sugar and fats. Haven't you read what the American Cancer Society says, that that is actually a bigger risk of cancer than smoking? What did you expect?" Nobody said that to me. So I got to experience that event surrounded by people who loved me. Surrounded by people who loved me and represented Jesus Christ. It was as if Jesus were surrounding me through them. And I got to experience it not blamed. The event, the experience of the event and the ongoing effects of the event. I hadn't been able to work for about 4 months. And my wife and I were talking, and we came to the very concerning conclusion that we did not have enough money to make our house payment. And we faced the very real possibility that in the middle of cancer, we're going to lose our house. As we were having that conversation, somebody came to the door, and it was Rod from church. and he's holding an ice cream bucket. And he says to me, "You know, we were thinking about you at church today, and we thought maybe you could use a little help." And he hands me the ice cream bucket, and it's full of cash and checks. And that covered our house payment, and we did not lose our house. A friend of mine who wasn't at that church was going through a similar cancer at the same time. And in the middle of cancer, they did lose their house. The event doesn't stop. There's these ongoing effects. And when you throw in abuse, often it's that you lose your community. You lose your family. You lose your friends. You lose so much around you. And there's all these ongoing effects. And it's not just, okay, who's in the middle of this right now? On Wednesday, I got the news that my cancer is back. And one of the first things that I thought of was, I know I won't be doing it alone, because I've seen the church. Because I've seen how people come around and surround me, but not just me, others who are hurting. And I know I won't have to do this alone. You see, as the church, we know how to respond to trauma because this is how God made us. This is what God does to us in the church. He equips us for this. But we forget when it comes to abuse. If the event has happened, it's happened, but do everything you can to prevent the event from happening. But if it's happened, you can't change the fact that it's happened. But you know what? As the church, we're stepping directly into how that event is experienced. We are stepping directly into the ongoing effects of that event. God has called us, God has equipped us to change the very nature of trauma in a person's life. And even if they're not experiencing it right now, they can watch us and they can see us. And then if it does happen to them, they can know, just like one of the first thoughts in my head was, I know I won't be alone. Then they too can think, I know I won't be alone. Because I've seen how they talk about it from the pulpit. I've seen how they talk about it in Sunday school class. I've seen how they address these things. And I know I won't be alone. I know I won't be blamed. I know I'll be loved because my church has shown me that again and again and again. And not just me, but everyone around me. This is our call as the church. And this is the hope. Because if it were just about the event, often when we find things out, that's done. And we can't change it. But we step into the experience, and we step into the effects, and we change the nature of trauma in a child's life. We change the nature of trauma in an adult's life, in a family's life. And so we have hope. How do we do this? I watched Hannah's presentation, and she had up the wheel that she put up there, and I had never seen that wheel before. And as soon as she got done, I walked up to her and I said, I'm going to be talking about 6 key principles. Your wheel has 5 of them. That's an amazing wheel. So these are 6 key principles of trauma-informed practice. They're put forth, again, by this organization, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. SAMHSA did not intend this, I'm pretty sure. I mean, they're a government agency. Every one of those principles is grounded in Scripture. SAMHSA came up with a very biblical model. Good for them. As we work both in our prevention, so that we can prevent abuse of all types, including preventing child abuse, And as we work on our response, how to care for somebody who's been impacted, these are the 6 principles we must keep in mind. Safety. Such an incredible foundation in Scripture. And you can see all these scriptures that talk about the importance of safety. It would be nice if more churches, for example, realize that faith leaders cannot be violent. So if you are a faith leader and you have hit your wife or your kids in a violent way, you can't hold that position anymore. The accountability that was talked about. Safety. How do we bring safety into our prevention and our response efforts? Well, we start by realizing, just like Jessica was saying, who gets to define safety? I don't define your safety. You define your safety. And I listen to how you define your safety. Is it safe to struggle? To not get why the heck God would allow this to happen. To not get why so many things are happening. Is it safe to struggle, or do you immediately get forced into this forced redemptive narrative? It's a really bad thing that you were abused. Now please, immediately now tell me how God's going to use that to his glory. Right? Because God uses all things for good. So I know you just let me know. So before we leave today, you've got 5 minutes. Tell me how God's going to use that for good. We can't have that forced redemptive narrative. It has to be okay to struggle. How do we teach about discipline? Are we teaching about discipline in a way that an unhealthy parent can really abuse? That now that unhealthy parent has a justification for the abuse that he heaps out on his family? How do we teach about abuse and sex? Do we talk about the difference between sin and being sinned against? Do we take important steps, such as, how many people here have ever heard a sermon that addressed the affair between David and Bathsheba? Right? Okay. So, like a good portion of Bible commentaries talk about the affair between David and Bathsheba. I've heard several sermons talked about the affair between David and Bathsheba, but let's look at this, right? David is not where he's supposed to be. David is supposed to be at war, and he's not, and he's criticized in Scripture for that. Then David's looking out on his kingdom. Bathsheba is doing the culturally normal thing, bathing on her roof. That's how they got hot water. It's the culturally normal thing. Not only that, there's a good chance that she was engaged in ritual bathing, so she was actually engaged in the fulfillment of her faith. And David looks out and says, "Hey, come on over." Now, in that day and age, what happens when you say, "No thanks, Mr. King"? It's something called death. Now, the last time I checked, when you are told, "Have sex with me or you will die," that's rape. There should be no sermon ever about the affair between David and Bathsheba, because there was no affair. There was a rape. So how are we talking about it in Scripture? Because if a survivor sees it laid out that way, and it's called an affair, do you think they're going to talk to the pastor about being raped? Of course not. So we have to consider all of these things. If you want, you can I've got my cards and whatnot out at the table out there, and I'll have it on a slide at the end. You can send me a request for the slides, and I'll go ahead and I'll send you the slides, which list out these resources. But here are just a number of incredible resources on helping to establish safety in our churches, in both our prevention and our response. Trustworthiness and transparency. This is the next thing that must characterize both our prevention and our response. It's super easy to fall into a trap here. And that trap is, how can I get people to trust me? That's not trustworthiness. Trustworthiness is, how do I act in a way that is worthy of trust? And then if somebody chooses to trust me, that's fine. But I'm not doing this to trick you into trusting me. I'm doing this because I am called to act in a way that is worthy of trust. And it's not about what I get out of it from you. So trustworthiness and transparency. Transparency includes what is shared, when it is shared, how it is shared. If you tell the congregation something that you need to have gone to seminary and beyond in order to understand, you did not tell the congregation anything. Again, scripture after scripture after scripture saying, be honest, be worthy of trust. And super important to note in the story of Joseph and his brothers, anyone think Joseph's brothers were trustworthy? Not really. Right? Because they did away with Joseph and then they lied to their dad about it, right? Wrong. They did put a bloody cloak in front of their dad. And then they kept their mouths shut and just let him come to whatever assumptions he reached. Trustworthiness is not just about what is said, it is also about what is not said. What we aren't sharing, as well as what we do share. Trustworthiness and transparency. What does that look like? Who's the priority? Having humility. Is what we are doing consistent with policy? We must have effective policies. There's a book called the Child Safeguarding Policy Guide. You must get the Child Safeguarding Policy Guide for your church. It's written by Boz Chividjian, who founded Grace, as well as Shira Berkovitz. Shira Berkovitz founded the organization called Sacred Spaces, which is very similar to Grace, but in Jewish faith communities. So Boz and Shira teamed up to write the Child Safeguarding Policy Guide. It is a thick book. Get that book. Use that to help guide the policies that you develop for your children's ministry. Reach out to Grace. Grace will do a free consultation. Reach out to Grace. We will do a free consultation on helping to develop policies and what are next steps. We do deeper policy development work, both at the local church and denominational level. But just reach out to Grace. We would love to help you. Get that book. It will help you have effective policies that don't just address what happens at church. Do you think most abuse happens at church? No. Most abuse happens away from church. Does your policy address that? What if you find out about abuse that wasn't at church? So we have to have comprehensive policies, and we have to be trustworthy enough to then act in a way that is consistent with our policy. Do we follow through? Do we clearly communicate? These are many of the things that really go towards trustworthiness and transparency. And if there's an allegation that something has occurred within that church, remember how we talked about the community being groomed? There is no place for an internal investigation. It must be an external investigation, because otherwise the people who've been groomed are the ones doing the investigation. And they're too close, and they're probably not trained. But they're certainly not equipped to do an objective investigation. Again, resources related to trustworthiness and transparency. Peer support. We must care for the basic support needs of those who have been harmed. Multiple scriptures. Peer support has two components. One, let's meet some basic needs. Two, let's empower those with shared experience, if they want, to be part of the support. I got told on Wednesday my cancer's back. Who's one of the first people I called? My Aunt Diane. Why did I call my Aunt Diane? Because she's stinking had cancer 4 times. I could talk to somebody who has no clue what I'm talking about because they've never had cancer. Or I can talk to my Aunt Diane, who's walked this path. So to the degree that the person wants, equip people with shared experience, because they will have way more knowledge than you can find in a book. Way more knowledge than you will find at a class. Way more knowledge than you will find in a training. And if you want evidence on the importance of shared experience in supporting a person, the importance of shared experience in connecting to a person and helping to find healing from harm, there's something called the incarnation. God said it's important enough that I'm going to do it. I'm going to have shared experience with you. And so he came in the form of Jesus so that he could have that shared experience. And what does it say? We don't have a high priest who doesn't get it. We have a high priest who's been tempted, who's experienced everything you have. So, elevating people with shared experience to the degree that they want to be part of how we respond. Many of the ways that we as a church can incorporate peer support. I'm rushing through this because I know we're getting tight on time. In case you're wondering, this is normally a 4-hour training. This is one of the most powerful quotes I know. It's from a youth in foster care. When asked what it means to have the support of your community, this foster youth said, it means having your side of the church full when you get married. Will you make sure that that kid who's been abused, maybe they're in foster care, maybe not, if they get married, their side of the church is full? Resources related to peer support. Collaboration and mutuality, again and again and again in Scripture. Work together on stuff. Don't do it alone. Collaboration and mutuality means that you are collaborating with the person who has been harmed, that they have a say in what is going on, that they have a say in charting the direction. It means that you are collaborating on your team, that you are not the only person making these decisions, and it means that you are collaborating outside of your group. It means that you are reaching, if you're part of a church, you are reaching out to area mental health providers for help. You are reaching out to other supports and services like some of the domestic violence and intimate partner violence resources that are here. You are reaching out to them, getting help, partnering with your Children's Advocacy Center. But you are working outside of your group as well to bring in that support. Other examples of what that looks like. And it includes mandated reporting, resources, empowerment, voice, and choice. Abuse, by its very nature, strips power away from a person. And we talked about a theology of power earlier, and that comes into play here. It is our job to walk alongside of a person as they take some of that power back. Scripture again and again talks about the use of power, but yet we as humans are vulnerable to misusing it. How vulnerable are we when Satan had to figure out what is my best chance to get Jesus to sin? He does 3 temptations that are recorded in Scripture. All 3 of them are to misuse power. As humans, we are vulnerable. And these are ways, as a church, that we can do a better job of empowering those who have been harmed, those who have been abused. Additional resources: cultural, historical, and gender factors. I don't need to say anything more than cultural, historical, and gender factors beyond, look at the makeup of this room. How many guys are here? Not too many. A couple years ago, I was part of a webinar called "Where Are All the Men?" We have to consider the cultural, historical, and gender factors. Why do guys not care? And I know that that's not across the board. There are guys who care here. There are guys who care that weren't able to come. But why is it almost always guys in the significant minority when we come to talking about protecting kids, when we come to addressing intimate partner violence? Other historical, culture, and gender factors can be often associated with how power is distributed by gender, other historical roles, but things that we need to consider. And along with that, we consider in Acts when believers said, hey, we're being discriminated against here based on our race, in how you distribute food and support and aid. We're being discriminated against. What did the early church do in the book of Acts? They said, you're right. We are sorry. Can you please help us figure out how to fix it? And then they appointed Stephen. Resources. When we do this, it's powerful. Another survivor said to me, I cried pretty hard for a few moments when she found out that her church was going to respond well. Well, not her church, her denomination. Her church blew it, but then she went to the denomination and they did okay. It's such a relief, and I'm still processing. Such joy, though. It's life-changing news. Somebody in the church entered into her trauma and changed the nature of trauma in her life. And that is what we can do. Thanks for listening. Sorry that it was so rushed. Please do reach out to me or come visit me at the table. Thank you very much.